The commercial airliner cruised at 35,000 feet over the Arizona desert when the two F-16 fighter jets appeared from nowhere, flanking the plane on both sides. Passengers pressed their faces against the windows, cameras out, hearts racing with that peculiar mixture of excitement and terror that comes when military aircraft suddenly materialize so close you can see the pilots' helmets. But these pilots weren't performing a routine escort or responding to a standard security protocol. They were searching for someone, and when they finally spotted him through the small oval window in seat 23 degrees Celsius, their radio chatter exploded with an urgency that made air traffic controllers sit up straighter in their chairs. The man they were looking for was David Morrison, a 38-year-old single father who had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. David didn't notice the jets at first. He was too busy trying to comfort his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, who sat beside him clutching a worn stuffed rabbit named Mr. Hops. They were flying from Phoenix to Washington, D.C. for what David had told Emma was a special trip, though the truth was far more complicated and infinitely more painful. The little girl with auburn braids and her father's green eyes had been sick for 3 years, battling a rare form of leukemia that had drained not just their savings but every ounce of hope David had managed to preserve through the loss of his wife to cancer 2 years prior. He was a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, watching helplessly as the two people who meant more than his own breath slipped through his fingers despite his every desperate effort to hold on. If this story already has you feeling something deep in your chest, if you believe in the power of hope even when everything seems lost, please take a moment right now to hit that like button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to this channel. Stories like David's remind us why we need to believe in second chances, in miracles, and in the goodness that still exists in this world. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts. 3 months earlier, David had been working double shifts as a paramedic, the same job that had introduced him to his late wife Sarah when he'd responded to a car accident where she'd been a witness. He was good at saving lives, had a wall of commendations and grateful letters from people he'd pulled back from the edge, but he couldn't save the ones who mattered most. Emma's medical bills had become mountains, insurance companies had become mazes of denials and exceptions, and the experimental treatment she needed was available at only one facility in the country, with a price tag that might as well have been written in stars for all the possibility David had of reaching it. He'd sold everything, borrowed from everyone, stood on street corners with a cardboard sign swallowing his pride bite by bitter bite, and still come up hundreds of thousands of dollars short. What nobody on that plane knew, what David himself barely believed, was that 6 years ago, before Emma was born, before Sarah got sick, he had been Captain David Morrison, an Air Force pilot who had flown missions that never made the news but had saved countless lives. On one particular night over hostile territory, his quick thinking and extraordinary skill had prevented what would have been a catastrophic international incident, guiding a damaged reconnaissance plane to safety when every system had failed and 3 other pilots had been lost. He'd been decorated quietly, thanked privately, and then medically discharged after an injury that ended his flying career but not his need to serve, which is why he'd become a paramedic. The Air Force didn't forget its heroes, but David had disappeared so completely into his private grief and struggle that he'd severed those connections. Too proud or too broken to ask for help from the brothers and sisters who would have moved heaven and earth for him. But one of those brothers, Colonel Marcus Wright, had never stopped looking. Marcus had heard through the grapevine about David's situation, had seen a local news story about the single-dad paramedic trying to save his daughter, and had recognized his old wingman immediately. What followed was a mobilization that would have made any military operation look simple. Marcus had contacted everyone who'd ever flown with David, everyone who remembered that night when Captain Morrison had brought them home against impossible odds, and together they'd done something beautiful. They'd raised the money, arranged for Emma's treatment, and planned something more, something that would remind David Morrison that heroes don't face their battles alone. The F-16 pilots weren't there to cause alarm. They were there to deliver an honor guard, to escort one of their own home. When the plane landed at Reagan National Airport, David and Emma walked onto the tarmac expecting nothing, and found themselves facing a formation of Air Force personnel standing at attention. Marcus Wright stepped forward, tears streaming down his weathered face, and rendered a salute so sharp it could have cut the sky. Behind him stood dozens of men and women in uniform, and behind them, a banner that read, "Welcome home, Captain Morrison. Emma's fight is our fight now." David's knees buckled, and strong hands caught him, the same way he'd caught so many others throughout his life. Emma looked up at her father, confused but sensing something profound was happening, and asked in her small voice why all these people were crying. David couldn't speak, could barely breathe through the tsunami of relief and gratitude and overwhelming emotion that crashed through the walls he'd built around his breaking heart. The treatment was funded, every penny accounted for, and more than that, he wasn't alone anymore. He'd spent so long being strong for everyone else, and now someone was being strong for him. If this story moved you, if you found yourself wiping tears or feeling that flutter of hope in your chest, please share this video with someone who needs to remember that miracles still happen. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because these are the stories that remind us what humanity can be at its best. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time someone showed up for you when you needed it most. 6 months later, Emma Morrison rang the bell at the Children's Hospital, the one they ring when treatment is complete, when the battle is won. Her father stood beside her, no longer alone, no longer drowning, surrounded by a family he'd forgotten he had. Sometimes heroes wear capes, and sometimes they wear flight suits, and sometimes they're just single dads trying to save their daughters. But the real miracle isn't just in the saving. It's in remembering that we're all worth saving, that asking for help isn't weakness but wisdom, and that the people who love us are always scanning the skies, always ready to fly to our side,